tend to toss the baby out with the bathwater. So it's important that we strike a balance between using sunlight as the best disinfectant and using a magnifying glass to zap the ants as they go by. These are important issues. Now, given everything that we've heard today, I think it would probably have benefited from having someone representing Saudi Arabia or the UAE to have actually been able to say something to these issues. But what I'd like to do with the time is to put things in a context that's both a regional context and in the context of U.S. foreign policy making, and also to discuss what it is that Saudi Arabia's Reform Plan 2030, its vision, what it's trying to accomplish and what it's doing. Saudi Arabia is, in fact, changing at a rapid pace. Among high-profile changes like allowing women to obtain driver's license and the opening of new movie theaters in the kingdom, there have been steady efforts on the ground to drive values of tolerance and change the progress at all levels of society. Saudi citizens believe now more than ever that their country is modernizing. As restrictions are being lifted, the kingdom moves towards a more moderate form of Islam. The Saudi people are beginning to see their country achieve a level of modernity that a few years ago they did not believe was going to be possible. Now, a key word in all of this is modernizing. For those who've studied Middle East history, the transition to modernity and the forces who want to move backward have been a constant struggle and a messy feature. Those who've studied the Ottoman Empire will be keenly aware of the struggle for modernity. I say this because it's important to judge the achievements and what's being attempted to accomplish, not by the scale and scope of Western achievements, but by the regional context and the unique history of these recently, by comparison, independent states in the Middle East. So, as far as the Saudi vision for 2030 is concerned, and what they're trying to do, which is new, 90% of Saudi homes will have access to high-speed broadband coverage. The kingdom created new bankruptcy laws on February. This will enhance the legal framework for business. This is important. The power of the religious police has been greatly diminished. They no longer have the right to detain or arrest individuals. The kingdom has opened up counseling and rehabilitation centers for people who have been engaged in extremist ideologies and terror organizations or been victims of extremists. Now, that's clearly important if you're going to look around the region and see some of the conflicts that are currently underway and raging. The Crown Prince has also lifted many media restrictions, and he's allowing more entertainment options to enter the kingdom. Again, I could go on with this list, but essentially, they're on a process toward modernity, and it's happening at a different pace. I think that the fact that they even have that to begin with is fairly important and is something that is lacking in a lot of the neighboring countries. As for women, this is another great metric, in fact, to gauge how a country is making a transition to modernity, as we'll see. But King Solomon's royal decree granted more than 6 million women the right to vote. Women make up now 22% of the Saudi workforce. The Crown Prince aims to increase that figure to 30% by 2030. 20% of the Shura Council members are now women. That's compared to 19% of the 115th U.S. Congress. Women have held positions in the Shura Council since 2013 and can now vote and run in municipal elections. Again, all these things were unthinkable just years ago. This is new. Now, if you're the United States, you sit back and you think to yourself, well, we've been doing a lot of this for a while. This is a struggle that has taken place in the Middle East for a long time. Now, I want to put things in a regional context because, again, as I said, women, using the issue of women's rights is definitely a metric where you can gauge the modernity of a country. But again, progress and reforms take place at different paces, and they often result in, I would say they basically they change. And where each country is on this transition toward modernity in the Middle East, I think you've seen a lot of hiccups along the way. For instance, Ataturk, right, he's considered the father of modern Turkey. He laid the groundwork for equality between men and women as far back as 1926. He realized his vision of a modern Turkey, it actually wouldn't happen if he was only utilizing half the population. This became an important thing that he saw before many, including in the West, saw. But it's hard to claim that today the direction and pace and quality of reform there resembles anything that he would have dreamed of back then. This has to do with locking up more journalists than pretty much most any other country. And I can tell you, having dealt with a lot of Middle East issues, specifically in Syria, when it comes to an American policymaker's perspective, the amount of headaches that our Defense Department, State Department is dealing with on a day-to-day basis on a host of issues right now. Turkey is the one that has us grabbing daily for a bottle of Tums, more so than Saudi Arabia, who is in fact an ally. So I think it's also important that we put this in a U.S. context for human rights, because right now, everything in the end boils back down to what is the United States going to do about it, and what is it that animates our foreign policy decisions. Now, we know that George W. Bush, he embarked on democracy promotion. We overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we didn't seem to do very well planning or implementing an aftermath plan there, and we're still dealing with the outcome of those decisions being made. But that was when we decided that the ideals that the United States has are simply transferable. That we could take the cookie cutter and implant that elsewhere. This turned out to be a rather expensive lesson that, of course, President Trump, this is what he ran on as part of his talking points and his worldview. So you had President Obama follow him, and of course, this is strategic realignment. Now, this wasn't something that he said specifically, but that was the purpose of the Iran deal, was to strategically realign the United States away from Saudi Arabia and away from Israel, our other allies that we've traditionally had in the region, and then to reorient ourselves toward Iran, because that would be a good address where there's just one country that we can deal with, and we can deal with them. And then also, of course, he didn't have much of an issue with Muslim Brotherhood. Really, the strategic realignment was to move the United States out, and of course, as we recall, pivot to Asia, because let the Middle East take care of itself. But of course, that's difficult to have happen with nuclear weapons in existence and being pursued by specific countries, because otherwise it's easier to say, yeah, let them go at each other with swords and spears, but we're talking now about nuclear weapons, and this is a problem that our adversaries are pursuing, and specifically I'm talking about Iran. So Trump's principled realism now is still, and America first, is stuck with a balance between our values and our interests. What do you do when you are trying to figure out who you're going to work with as an ally? Who has a future plan that you want to adopt and work with and move toward? And really, you see that we are basically at a point where the region has been pretty polarized for a while. And you have the traditional Arab power centers throughout past, previous decades. You've had Saudi Arabia, you've had Egypt, if you're talking about the Sunni Arab world. And of course, if you're these countries and you have long-standing rulers who last for a long period of time, you look at the United States and think to yourself, every 4 to 10 years, you get 4 to 8 years, obviously, you get a new president, and they can overturn everything that we have heard before. Now, this has been another feature of our politics, is that we tend to throw out and do the exact opposite when a new president comes in. I don't think we've done a really good job of learning from our mistakes. So you can argue that the democracy promotion, putting humanitarian issues first as a higher priority for what the United States should pursue abroad, that should be what governs us. But when you fail and you learn, you can learn from it rather than say, well, then we should just never have that be a feature in our foreign policy again. big problem that I think that we're going to be facing as we go forward is that we have a polarized Middle East that remains now with Qatar and Turkey pretty much promoting Muslim Brotherhood. And they have been hedging their bets because the United States vacillates in its policy and hasn't really shown whether it's going to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So Turkey, for a variety of reasons, of course, with Syria, has its own interests, and all these countries have their own interests. But the larger Sunni world happens to be what we are aligned with and have been for generations past. And this is where our actual interests lie, if for no other reason than because of the situation with Iran, which is their pursuit of nuclear weapons, which is something that even now those who supported the deal really have trouble defending with all of the evidence of their militarization program, which has come forward because of the Mossad and their operation. Now, another problem that we see, and this is on the left and the right, people who said we shouldn't have anything to do with overthrowing Saddam Hussein, right? It would unleash these levels. And that left a deep scar, obviously, on the American psyche, enough that, again, this is one of Trump's major talking points. So that was the idea now, that we should not overturn any government, not be in charge of picking winners and losers, because we tend to do that poorly. Now, in the same breath, a lot of these people who feel that will say that we must keep Assad in Syria because who knows what will be unleashed. Doesn't matter the devil that we know he in fact is, but that he must be the solution. And Syria is really a country that I deal with very much on a daily basis. The amount of horrific human rights abuses that go on there by the second is literally appalling. But the idea that we should not remove Assad is so strong that that really the American political body, the American public, doesn't want to see the United States do too much. But at the same time, these same people, a lot of them, would decide that they would want to play Game of Thrones in Saudi Arabia, and that they think that we can then kind of pick and choose which family side we want to then be the crown prince, which one's going to lead. Now, in the end, we're still going to be working with Saudi Arabia, but we would end up with a very hobbled leadership structure, with a country that is more annoyed with the United States. So it doesn't really advance our interests too much. Now, there needs to be an interest. First of all, our allies, how we group with people is based on interests. That's the most important part for the United States. What we try to do is get them to match our values. And when we look at the Middle East, there's maybe a country that we look at and say, they're like us, they resemble us, they're democratic, and they have institutions, and we share values, and we share interests as well, because they don't like Iran. But in the rest of the region, we look very much at interests, and this is simply a major feature of a realism way of thinking. So, before I leave it, I just want to say we should be very careful to think through what we're trying to do when we are shining lights on something that is clearly bad, and all of these countries have a lot of skeletons in their closet, some more than others. But when it comes to a foreign policy perspective, you have to make them based on shared interests. That is the most important aspect. And it would be nice if the United States and presidents in our political system, because we have basically turned this into a Democrats for Iran and Republicans against Iran, and with that comes much of the Middle East and Qatar and Turkey then being a Democrat thing, and this is the direction that it has gone. I think it would be really helpful if we tried choosing the Goldilocks policy instead of vacillating from one to the other. So if we keep going and trying to implement the exact opposite of what we've done before, we're going to end up precariously balanced. I think there's a lot in the past and our own failures and our own attempts that we can learn from, and that we should pick perhaps the Goldilocks soup, the one in the middle, rather than far right or far left. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm just going to start off with a quick question, and as you're answering, I'll go through this small pile here. I'm hearing a lot about interests versus values, and I still, you know, and it's not your fault, Matthew, because I'm constantly vexed by this when I'm watching the news and I'm attending conferences like this. What is the main interest of the United States with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that we need to protect so much that we are willing to overlook our democratic values, whether it be the forced detentions, the torture, the treatment of migrant workers, the 9/11 hijackers, the lobbying organization machinery in this country that's influencing our members of Congress. Go on, the Wahhabism being exported in complete opposition to what we're trying to do in the region. Tell me what that interest is. Like, convince me that we need to keep this alliance going so much that we are willing to violate our own core principles as America.
If we use, as you say, humanitarian, these issues as how we're going to base our foreign policy everywhere, we would first of all have no allies in the region. And remember, we're competing with countries such as China and Russia, who they don't really care. China basically, in many cases, just sees dollar signs, and they avoid all this. They'll invest in anything. Russia, if you look at their behavior, again, just take a look at the war in Syria, bombing hospitals and bombing schools, like as a target. And this is something that is being done just to further their objectives. Of course, Assad using chemical weapons. This is now normalized, unfortunately, scarily, behavior. We have tried many times throughout our history to disengage from various parts of the world. Obviously, before World War II, we didn't want anything to do with it until we were actually attacked and forced into it. One could seriously argue how much better the world would have been off if we would have gotten involved sooner. The fact is, the Middle East still for energy right now, but also because, again, the nuclear issue is such a large problem. When you deal with the nuclear, if everyone had no way of breaking the containment of an area, then you could sit back and either say, we're going to only deal with you based on human rights, we have no other interests, or say, you know what, forget it, I wash my hands of the region. But since we're there, we have to create our priorities in a way that I think is going to work for America's interest. And it's weird because I'm not someone who quotes Trump all the time at all, but American first and his principled realism. Now, one can argue about his principles, whether it should be more value-based than interest-based, but he's looking after American interests, which I think is important.
But what are those priorities?
Those priorities are not having Iran with a nuclear weapon that is currently taking over Iraq, that it already owns Lebanon, and that it is basically made the civil war in Syria rage on for a long period of time. We're now dealing with 500,000 people dead. 500,000 in this year, right now. And this isn't hidden. You can open up any Twitter feed and look at who I follow and see from a multitude of journalists who are on there and see really, really heinous crimes being committed every day. This is the reality. We don't want to see that making gains. Now, Saudi Arabia, of course, comes from a Wahhabist background. They're reforming. this is a process that's going to take time, and obviously that's in our interest. And of course, when we have allies that are doing things that we disagree with, we talk of them. Of course, we've had President Obama, who was really good at taking our allies and throwing them under the bus in front of everyone to see. He made a good, that was one of his major accomplishments. I don't think it accomplished anything better than when you talk to your allies, speaking to them firmly, and I would be shocked to hear if President Trump or Pompeo or Bolton didn't have private conversations that were fairly stern, that laid out what America will and won't accept.
I would say that it's not so much an issue of human rights violations here, but an adherence to what we consider important in an ally, and that is respect for the law, respect for the treaties that they've signed. Because if we turn a blind eye to that because we're worried about nuclear Iran, we're going to see more and more of this rogue behavior that is going to lead to a severe escalation where citizens of the United States are simply not safe.
Right, and I think the point he's making actually dovetails with what I was saying earlier about the Democratic Party, so that Democrats and a significant number of Republicans hear that argument. They hear, okay, the reason we have to tolerate all of this rogue behavior from the UAE and from Saudi Arabia is because we need to check Iran, and if we don't do this, Iran will run amok. And unsaid in that, and sometimes said in that, is that the reason we need to do this is because it's in Israel's interest in the region there. And then they say, well, okay, but Saudi Arabia and the UAE are running amok. So if the worst that's going to happen is that Iran is going to run amok, why don't we actually just sit down with Iran, negotiate a nuclear treaty, bring them out?
Exactly.
That's the goal. That's the goal of the pressure campaign.
And that's why the Gulf states were so resistant to those negotiations, because they saw that
we can see that up front, the goal.
If you don't have the threat of Iran destroying the world, then you don't have any reason to justify the rogue behavior.
Right, then you readjust your priorities.
At the same time, Saudi and the UAE obviously want the relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom more than we actually need it from them. We would find a solution no matter what. And that's no reason or justification for continuing to allow them to act in this manner. It's definitely against US interests that we have an ally that is acting in a way that is not congruent with what we want in an ally. And we have to stand up for that.
I don't think we get to choose who, in the region, if the United States is going to be a world power, it's going to be involved in all corners of the globe, and it's going to then have to pick which side it wants to be on. That's simply it. The United States didn't look at the Soviet Union in the late 30s and 40s and think, that Stalin's awesome. And that's an extreme example, but you pick the side you're going to be on. And of course, yeah, I agree. On a host of issues where we could have conversations to change their behavior. I mean, this is what we do with any country, is we try to change their behavior to benefit us. That's what any country that's putting their own interests first is going to do, and that's what, I believe that's what happens. I just don't think it can be the governing aspect of our foreign policy making, and I'm not even sure what it looks like when you say that we let them. I don't know what it looks like really. We're letting, again, in Syria, our prime enemy or adversary, as we've defined it, kill people daily. And this is apparently not an issue then.
The issue is that I think they're taking it to our land. I mean, we have threats, as I spoke about earlier, with Sheikh Mohammed actually telling a US citizen and a Finnish citizen that I can get you anywhere in the world, and that he can come to America, pluck you off the street in a big black van and disappear you, and this is acceptable, and that we should allow it because of our interests in the Middle East. We don't have to. We can have both, actually. We can have our interests in the Middle East, but also the knowledge from these countries that this behavior is not acceptable, and they will listen. They have commercial interests. We have Virgin and Richard Branson actually pulling out commercially of Saudi. Because of the Khashoggi killing, I mean, there's many ways to prove a point, and there's many ways that can be done so, either diplomatically or through commercial pressures. And I don't think one cancels the other. I think we can have both.
Okay, let's get to some questions. We'll try to do sort of a rapid fire round on this because I have several here and we only have about 10 minutes? Okay, great. Okay, 12 if I like, okay. This one's from Ben Freeman in the audience from the last panel. He's asking, Matt, do you believe the CIA's conclusion that MBS ordered the killing of Khashoggi? And I'm going to add, what should we do about it if you believe it?
What Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis said is that that's not what was concluded in it. There may be a difference between whether it was the Crown Prince was involved directly or not, but we haven't actually seen the CIA report. Now, I have no doubt, based on what Saudi Arabia has already even said, that Khashoggi was killed. That's a problem, and of course there should be a response to it, and we've had a response to it, which is to sanction 17 individuals according to the Magnitsky Act, and of course to have conversations. But again, what's the penalty when you gas 1,000 people? Then what are we looking at? Because that's Eastern Ghouta in Syria with an enemy, someone who's an enemy behaving that way, as opposed to someone who certainly went too far, and that's unacceptable. So I don't know that it's a matter of believing the CIA report because we haven't seen it, and apparently what's been reported, so much of it is not turned out to be accurate.
I mean, I would go out on a limb and say absolutely. There's no doubt whatsoever in my experience that of course he knew about it. There's no way that any intelligence agents or security advisors of his or agents would act without his direct instruction. And the same can be said from the UAE in my experience there with tortures that have been instructed at the highest levels. It would be impossible for him not to be directly involved. I think with Khashoggi, certainly, already, obviously, they've suffered commercial and public relations issues. And I don't think that we can accept that this behavior is okay unsanctioned, whether that's through diplomatic conversations or some other review of the alliance, or even absolutely talking about it in public and not saying that it's okay for this to happen. I don't want to walk into an embassy one day and be chopped up to little pieces and no one cares because, well, they're our friend.
Yeah, I'm not sure that anyone has said that it's okay by any stretch of the imagination. We're not condoning such behavior.
No. However, if MBS continues to, there has to be something very serious done about it, very public, and preferably he would be moved aside in power. I don't think we can have people.
How are we going to now start playing Game of Thrones with Saudi Arabia? Look at, again, this is just what I spoke about, the inconsistencies in a lot of these arguments. I think it would be incredibly disastrous if we actually had our foreign policy determined only by humanitarian issues. And I think humanitarian issues are extremely important. I don't detract from that part. I'm just saying when it comes to dealing with the rest of the world, our country and American interests, it's not the prime thing. We're going to be left with a weaker Saudi Arabia that's extremely angry with us, and the family, it's still a monarchy and it's still going to rule for a long period of time. So we've made our case and we feel good about ourselves, and then we get the worst of all worlds later. That to me sounds not really smart.
I think it's not a humanitarian issue so much as a legal issue. And if this goes without some sort of solution, it's just going to extend and escalate. And then soon, we'll have Saudi picking people off the streets in the United States. And it sets an example to countries like the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries that this behavior is tolerated, if not condoned, by the United States.
The behavior of the Middle East, look at how succession has worked there for a long period of time. When the Ottoman Empire and any of these places, ask these siblings of those, it's not America over there. It's a different world in a different context.
Certainly so, but with their growing influence in the US and the UK, I don't think we should just be turning a blind eye to, oh, well, that's the Arabs and that's how they do it. They're intermingling in our world.
The growing influence of Saudi Arabia pales in comparison to the money and the lobbyists being paid for by Qatar. Throughout this town has been sloshing around, and we know that. So,
No, we don't
and we know
know that.
we do, and we also know
I have to
about
disagree
Muslim
with you
Brotherhood
here,
promotion,
that-
whether it's Turkey or them, so you pick one side or the other.
The influence doesn't pale in comparison to Qatar or the UAE.
Okay, you
And
can then
so we
say
have
it's
that-
by
We have
comparison
somebody in
to
the
Qatar.
audience who's done the research on all the FARA reports, on all the lobbyists that are being paid in this town by the Saudi Arabians and the UAE, and the numbers are
So
pretty stark.
everyone who's done it has signed up for Pharaoh, you're saying then? Like, okay?
Yeah, that doesn't count everybody who's working for Saudi or UAE off the books. So we have to be fair here. The amount of influence in this town is great, and it is not being dwarfed by that of Qatar.
And not only that, but the influence of Yemen in Washington is nil. And as a result, you can see what's happening to that country. And Iran, because of our relationship with them, doesn't spread money all over Washington. And as a result, we get this tilted policy.
Right, and even in the Yemen war, we see how it's been framed too, as a part of this left-right debate. It's now, are you for or against the war in Yemen? Instead of having it actually framed properly as, would you like Iran to win there because that's where it's waging its war? And then the added part where the U.S. is on both sides, which it needs to figure out, if we don't want to be involved overseas, and we don't want to be doing the dirty work ourselves, and we're the country that apparently, and maybe one or two others, that are really trying to be careful not to kill civilians during warfare, we want to pull back, but then we're going to end up seeing what war is like when it's fought by other countries, which is how it's always been fought.
I do want to add one thing quickly on that that complicates that slightly, which is that, and I reported on this, I think, in 2015, when the Houthis entered the capital, the U.S. had intelligence intercepts at the time that revealed that the Iranians were telling them not to go forward. They said, this is a mistake. Do not do this. You're in a strong negotiating position. Just try to finish up your negotiations here. You don't need to turn this into a violent situation. They went anyway. The Houthis have their own agency. Iran has been happy at times, certainly, to help inflame the situation because it's clearly having a huge draining effect on Saudi Arabia. But the notion that Iran is taking over this area is just false.
The notion, though, that it is a proxy battle, essentially, between the larger powers is fairly, I think, fairly accurate.
Right, but it's one that has an out that does not require the UAE and Saudi Arabia to slaughter everybody and take over militarily.
Or the other way around, sure. But again, the framing right now is, are you pro war in Yemen? Well, then just stop the war in Yemen. Has about the depth of thought level, like about that deep, it's an inch or so or something. Again, these parts all need to fit in part of the tapestry of what our interests are globally. But yeah, sure.
Okay, let's get to some more questions. This one is from Katerina Medic. Ryan mentioned that the agenda of the New Democrats included using human rights violations as a means to push for their goals. Can you all speak about how we can shed some light on cases like Jamal's and other human rights violations and the role of the media to help facilitate a change?
I mean, in my experience over the past 10 years, cases that haven't been raised to the media, that haven't been spoken about, that haven't been televised, in those cases, the people are still in jail, or they're still suffering human rights abuses. The UAE in particular, and other Middle Eastern countries, have not responded to polite requests. They've not responded to their legal system because, frankly, it's in shambles anyway. There is no due process, there's no justice, there's no ability to defend yourself with evidence at trial. As we saw with Matthew Hedges, the trial lasted 5 minutes and he was found guilty of espionage. And that sentence will follow him around for the rest of his life. When he, for example, enters a country, he's going to have to say, yes, I was convicted of being a spy. In times where I've represented clients in particular, over the past 12 to 24 months even, we've seen people facing years in prison. Some have been convicted and jailed. As soon as I've taken it to press and as soon as I've got the spotlight on it, the royals have intervened, and that's facilitated their release, which just shows how lawless the system is over there. It shouldn't be possible for a ruler to intervene in a case just because it's been in press. What about the people who can't get press? Their case isn't that interesting to media, for example, or they're of another nationality, for example. India are less likely to care about one particular person because their population's so large. So it's almost terrifying that your only way to get out of injustice and imprisonment is to use the media. But it's just, I mean, it's fantastic that the media has actually learned this in the UK to the point where they feel like they're human rights activists now. They're calling me saying, do you have any more cases that we can get people free? And I mean, that's so concerning for the Middle East in general, but that's the role the media plays. More so, the media plays more of a role in facilitating the release of prisoners than the government does.
Anybody want to add to that, or, okay. We have a question from Adele Nazarian. Human rights includes the right to privacy. How should we think about this right in our digital era, when states have so many more tools now at their disposal to violate our privacy? And I would just tack on to that some of the stories about, you know, Twitter trolls, in particular in Saudi Arabia, tracking social media accounts and punishing or targeting people for what they tweet or don't tweet.
I see in the UAE this is a huge problem with the implementation of the 2015 cybercrime laws that criminalize practically anything you can imagine. They have a telecoms regulatory authority that literally scours Facebook and Twitter looking for things that they convict people on. In some cases I've dealt with, this has included something like sharing a fundraiser from, you know, let's say a fox hunting charity. A friend of mine, actually, I'd known him for 7 years before he was convicted there. He had shared a charity on Facebook that was raising money for Afghani children to pay for blankets. He was arrested. It was only after a 3-week media campaign that he was actually released. Otherwise, he would have faced 3 years in prison. The other issue with that is that if you have an enemy or a frenemy or someone who doesn't like you, someone you've upset, they can go onto Twitter, go onto Facebook, have a look at everything that you've posted over the past several years and find something and report you. Once they report you, the regulation authority has the obligation to follow up and convict you. And with convictions basically automatic, it's been a real problem. My colleague himself spent 4 months in prison over Twitter abuse before being finally acquitted due to media. But I mean, that includes saying anything defamatory, as I said, the weather, defamatory against the government, anything. The expats in the UAE were actually warned in the national newspaper, do not say anything about this Princess Latifah case. If you do, you will face imprisonment for lengthy periods of time. In my experience, journalists there have been extremely cautious about what they share, what they post, and most of them are extremely happy to finally leave the UAE, where they actually have the ability to speak freely.
This is actually something that I think is important, that gives me an opportunity to touch on something that I had to leave out for time before, because the security of people's most private data is a human rights issue for certain. And this is especially the case when it's the foreign government violating the privacy rights of Americans. To make everyone aware of the case I'm talking about is Jamal Benamar, a Moroccan and British national who was accused of hacking the emails of more than 1,000 opponents of the Qatari state. Once he was caught, he made a dubious claim to be a diplomat, even though his diplomatic work ended long ago. Frivolous claims of diplomatic immunity shouldn't prevent the dispensation of justice, and they shouldn't prevent Qatar from facing justice for these crimes either. So it raises a number of national security issues in addition to human rights concerns. We all know about the funding that they have for Hamas and the promotion of Muslim Brotherhood, something that was once very common around the region, at one point, but the Saudis and the Emiratis stopped funding these Islamist groups. The Qataris continue to do so, and they're proud of it. Every few months, the ruling family in Qatar is seen photographing and kissing Yusuf al-Qaradawi, we know, a man who was called for the killing of Americans, and he still praises Hitler's extermination of the Jews. This is a terrorism issue, but clearly it's a human rights issue as well.
On the other side, she talked about the consequences of public posts, but to your question about private ones, it's a terrifying question because the cyber sleuthing abilities of the UAE and Israel are extraordinary at this point, and it's been shown that they're willing to exploit these capabilities against adversaries, rivals, or non-supporters in ways that are going to change the way that we can communicate and it's something that at The Intercept we take extremely seriously, and the organization that owns us has invested heavily in encryption and in other forms of data protection, but it's a constant arms race. The kind of norms around it have been completely broken, so it's now just a technological contest.
Right, and our own government here in the United States has hardly
Yeah.
been innocent in that.
No, our government has been the one that has led the way on it. Yeah.
And The Intercept has done lots of great work in investigative journalism in that area. This one is to Radha. The influence of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have in the U.S. is a result of their lobbying and PR and money they give to think tanks, et cetera. How do others counter that power? Do any others, including Qatar, understand how to compete with their influence here in the United States?
Interesting question. I think it's all quite new to the opposition to this extreme lobbying, and that we are behind the 8 ball on that. The private sector, as I said, with Virgin pulling out of Saudi, are leading the way, but at the same time we have the UAE and Saudi really heavily promoting in racing, in the commercial sector. They're donating to education, to even churches, and buying up most of the property in London. It's hard to compete with that, but the way that we have been doing it, and I think quite successfully, and with even more success as we go on, is raising these issues to the press, which has a direct impact on investment and on tourism in the country, to the point where we've recently had the government of an emirate in the UAE for the first time approach us and say, okay, I think it's time that we had a conversation. What can we do to change? Can we do to stop you talking about us? And I mean, that's a wonderful step, because for at least 8 years, I have approached the governments of different emirates in the UAE and asked them to have that conversation. And I've obviously been met with the silent treatment. In other emirates, they have responded simply by releasing whoever I'm talking about at that time, but it's great to see one of the emirates in particular actually looking to make those improvements, to step up and become, the modern location that they market themselves as being. And I think that competition also is against the other emirates in the UAE, and they do want to compete against them. So I think continuing to raise it in the media, continuing at think tanks, in policy, with government officials, I think that's the way that ultimately leads to change.
Matthew, I would imagine that you might have a different take on that.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat myself, so I'll pass.
I think I see George looming. I have to put this up, even though I would prefer to keep talking about it, but.
There's also that's a signal.
Well, thank you very much, panelists, for this wonderfully lively conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm grateful that you all